Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a couple of things. First, we have a trade for the Sharks, as well as some waiver wire news from today. Let's start off with that trade as the Sharks acquired defenseman Ryan Ellis from the Philadelphia Flyers, along with a conditional 6th-round pick in exchange for Artem Guriev and Carl Grundstrom. And this was a move that we have been waiting for the Sharks to make for multiple weeks, if not a couple of months at this point, which is a positive contract move as the Sharks give up 2 players and only get back 1 in return. This was absolutely necessary to get done, as it is projected that both Michael Misa and Sam Dickinson will make the Sharks' NHL opening night roster, and the moment that they played over 9 games, their entry-level contracts would kick in, placing the Sharks at 51 out of 50 contracts. But with this move getting done, that will now, worst comes to worst, be 50 out of 50 contracts, which at the very least is legal, even if it is not optimal, as most teams usually want some level of flexibility. So another move could be coming down the pipeline, but at the very least they aren't forced to make such a decision. And so that's the real value of this trade, but we can still evaluate the actual assets that the Sharks are getting back in return. First, they give up Guriev, who is a player who played the majority of this past season in the ECHL, so he was likely not going to be much of a factor for the San Jose Barracuda, never mind the San Jose Sharks. And then while Carl Grundstrom did play a good chunk of games in the NHL for San Jose last year, he was someone who was surpassed by multiple players in this year's preseason, to the point where it was very likely that he would get placed on waivers by the Sharks today. And in fact, the team that acquired him, the Flyers, he got placed on waivers anyway by them. Now, what the Sharks get back here, the conditional 6th-round pick, the condition on it is that it'll be the higher of the 2 6th-rounders that the Flyers do have. So not exactly a huge asset, but still something. And then Ryan Ellis is a player who is in a similar type of situation as Carey Price or Logan Couture, which is a player who is essentially retired, but is allowing their contract to actually play out so that they can get paid before they actually retire sort of officially. Now, there is one major difference, however, between Ryan Ellis and Carey Price, which is that Carey Price has just 1 year left on his contract. It expires at the end of this season, which means when the Sharks acquired him in early September, they had already really settled up their cap situation for the year, and so there was literally zero consequence to picking up that player. Ryan Ellis, on the other hand, his contract expires at the end of next season, at the end of the 26-27 campaign, and so it does complicate things a little bit. However, not only is this unlikely to actually be much of a terrible contract for the Sharks to deal with, it actually could work to their benefit, because next year the Sharks will still have a lot of their top guys on very cheap contracts. Celebrini at the end of his ELC final year, same with Will Smith. Askarov is on the final year of a $2 million deal. They don't really need much cap space until 27-28 when they have to sign those players to their first big contracts in the NHL. And by then, not only will Ryan Ellis's contract be off the books, but so will Logan Couture's, and then the money from the Erik Karlsson retention, as well as the money from the Mark-Edouard Vlasic buyout and the Martin Jones buyout. And so there will be the space to actually make it happen. Next year, Ryan Ellis's contract will even be useful to be able to hit the salary cap floor. It is slightly unfortunate that even in 26-27, the Sharks will mostly be worrying about hitting the salary cap floor, but what are you going to do about it? That's the situation that the Sharks are in. Moving on to the waiver wire situation, honestly, probably more interesting at this point. Today was the deadline to be able to place players onto waivers, because tomorrow is the deadline to submit your opening night roster, and waiver players do need that extra 24 hours to process. And here it is not only interesting to see who was placed on waivers, but who was not placed on waivers for the Sharks. And San Jose only ended up sending down one singular player, at least waiving one singular player, and that was Pavel Regenda. Not a huge surprise, but definitely a little bit disappointing. Regenda came into this preseason hoping to make a big impact, enough to actually crack the NHL roster, and he did just about everything he possibly could to do so. His performance just a couple of nights ago against the Vegas Golden Knights, where he picked up 4 assists against a Golden Knights team that was icing pretty much their full NHL roster, was extremely impressive and likely the best performance out of any player in any preseason game this season. And yet it was just not enough. Warsofsky and Mike Greer choosing to double down on the players who they either already have or who they had acquired in a trade this past offseason, and as such, Regenda is a casualty of that. Now, there might still be a chance that he could end up playing in the NHL this year because he could get picked up by a team off of waivers. Some people might look at it and say, well, if he can't crack the worst roster in the NHL, why would he be able to crack a better team? Well, it's because the worst roster in the NHL is deciding to commit to the worst players in the NHL, and so a guy like Regenda does end up slipping through the cracks. So I don't think there's like any sort of guarantee or even like that much of a high chance that Regenda gets picked up, but it is certainly a possibility. Which does bring me to the forwards who did not get placed onto waivers, that being Ty Dellandrea, Barclay Goodrow, and Ryan Reaves, who will likely end up being the Sharks' 11th, 12th, and 13th forwards. There was a slight possibility and a much larger possibility in terms of Ty Dellandrea coming into this preseason, but to be fair to these players, they did end up looking pretty good. Dellandrea played 3 games. His first one was quite bad, but his second was really good, and his third was pretty good to end up with an above average preseason performance. Ryan Reaves played a couple of games, and he was actually quite good in both of them. Barclay Goodrow, a little bit less so, because he only also played 2 games, but one of them was quite bad, the other was good, and so it ended up being kind of like an average preseason, but it was enough for the San Jose Sharks to commit to them for yet another season. I could kind of understand Ty Dellandrea because he is a little bit younger, and so there's a chance he turns things around, but for both Barclay Goodrow and Ryan Reaves, are we really going to pretend that like one or a couple of good preseason games here is actually going to shift their career in the positive direction? The fact is that both of these players are over the age of 30, and for Ryan Reaves, he is almost 40 years of age as he sits at 38, and they have not been good for any of the last couple of seasons. And as the pace picks up, in particular from Reeves' perspective, where that is kind of his weakness, he is a slower player, as the pace picks up in the regular season, is Reaves really going to be able to come out and make an impact on every other night, since he's probably not even going to be an 82-game season guy? He's like a 13th forward. Probably not. And in particular with Barclay Goodrow, similar situation here. 32 years of age. His last 2 seasons have been very bad. Like, he's been one of the worst players in the NHL at even strength for the last 2 seasons. Are we really expecting him to suddenly become a serviceable 4th-line player moving forward? Almost certainly not. And so to kind of hitch your wagon to these 2 players who are on the downward trend instead of maybe gambling on a player who's on the upward trend like someone like Regenda is somewhat questionable in my mind. There is also the idea here that while it is the waiver wire deadline, for the next 24 hours or so, we can still send down other players who don't have to pass through waivers. That's where a guy like Luca Cagnoni on the defensive side of things comes in, or Ethan Cardwell on the forward side of things, or Zach Ostapchuk as well does come in. So expect those guys to be sent down pretty soon, I would imagine, since again, you can't send down at this point Reaves, Goodrow, or Ty Dellandrea, and the Sharks are likely going to be running with 13 forwards, which does actually bring me to the defense. No defensemen were waived for the San Jose Sharks, and this isn't fully surprising in the case of a guy like Timothy Liljegren or Vincent Desharnais. It was expected that the Sharks would go with 8 defensemen, but the biggest news on the waiver wire today is actually that Jack Thompson does not get placed onto waivers, which brings up some very major questions for the San Jose Sharks, because this gives them 9 defensemen, again, assuming Cagnoni gets sent down sooner rather than later. This gives them 9 NHL defensemen. And so there are 2 options to rectify this situation, the first of which is to have someone who is expected to be on the opening night roster get placed onto the injured reserve, because then you don't count against the 23-man roster, and as such, Jack Thompson can fit in there. So potentially a guy like Orlov, or maybe even more so a guy like Klingberg. Neither of these 2 players played the last 2 preseason games, and so maybe one is injured, or at least can pass as injured, and that gives the Sharks a little bit of roster flexibility. But if nobody ends up joining the IR, the other option here is that the Sharks, as I mentioned, they send down someone who is expected to make the opening night roster, but is not or is waiver exempt, and as such didn't have to be sent down at today's deadline. Now, it's not going to be Celebrini or Smith, obviously, and I highly doubt that it'll be Sam Dickinson or Michael Misa, because that would be a terrible move. And so all signs, they kind of point towards Colin Graf, a player who the Sharks did not play yesterday, and I was a little worried about that, and now I am even more so worried about it. if Colin Graf does end up getting sent down and is not on that opening night roster deadline by Monday, he will not play the first game of the season. I'm pretty certain about that. And that just feels like an incorrect move, even if it really ends up being more of a paper transaction because the Sharks have something in the works, but they need a little bit more time to actually get it done. And so Graf gets called back up for like game 2 of the season. It does still just feel like kind of a missed opportunity here. This is a player who definitely deserves to be on the opening night roster. This is a player who does give you a good chance of actually winning games. And for a team that was most likely looking to start the season on a high note, try to pick up a win or at least have a good performance in that first game against the Vegas Golden Knights, Colin Graf gives you a better chance at that than a lot of the other guys who are going to be littering the Sharks' bottom 6, if not just their 4th line in general. And so we'll see what ends up playing out. Obviously, there can be moves made over the next 24 hours that completely invalidate what I am saying in this video. But right now, the fact that the Sharks didn't place Jack Thompson onto waivers is kind of leaving us scratching our heads, because Thompson didn't even really do much in this preseason to really deserve this kind of like extra length. You know, it would be one thing if he had showed up and played really well and that put the Sharks into a tough position, but that's not quite what happened at all. He definitely got outperformed quite significantly by even Luca Cagnoni here in this preseason. And so not only would Thompson like deserve kind of to be placed onto waivers, I'm not even sure if anyone would actually pick him up if they were, you know, spectating these games that he has put in. So he was someone who probably could have just headed to the San Jose Barracuda, no harm, no foul, but now the Sharks have put them a little bit in a corner at this point. Class dismissed.